In this episode, we talk about Bihar government schools striking off the names of more than 20 lakh students. We also give you an update about ED raids in Rajasthan. But first, we bring you a ground report from Israel. Hi, I'm Rahel Philipose, and you are listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. For over 2 weeks now, Israel and the Palestinian militant group Hamas have been entangled in what is widely being described as the deadliest war the region has witnessed in several decades. The recent outbreak of violence began when Hamas launched cross-border strikes on Israel, resulting in the killing of thousands and the capture of several hundred hostages. In response, Israel initiated airstrikes on the Gaza Strip and declared a siege in the disputed territory. The humanitarian impact of the conflict has been unprecedented, with thousands of casualties on both sides of the border. As Israel prepares for a potential ground operation, there are concerns that the crisis could escalate further. The Indian Express's diplomatic affairs editor Shubhajit Roy, who was in Israel last week, tells us about the situation on ground. So Shubhajit, can you start by telling us what was the first thing you noticed when you landed in Israel?
One of the things, once I was in the flight to Israel and I flew via Addis Ababa. And on the way to Israel, on the way to Tel Aviv, the flight was full of Israelis who were returning to their homeland, to their country, to essentially join in the war effort. The flight was full and there were hardly any other foreigner except for me and a couple of other journalists from other countries. But they're all Israelis returning to their country at the call of the Israeli army to join in the war effort. They have all obviously served in the army for the mandatory 2 to 3 years. Some had a longer career as well. And they were holidaying in different parts of the world. So people were there from Japan, from India, from Africa, from Latin America. And they were essentially going back to fight the war. So that to me was very, very interesting. Once it got through the immigration, one could see families had come to receive their family members who had come on the flight with balloons, with placards, with their dogs to welcome them back. And in fact, there were young boys and girls, young teenagers. And it was, mind you, I landed at around 3 a.m., 2:30 a.m. And at 3 a.m., these young boys and girls were cheering and clapping on welcoming the Israelis who were getting back to join in the war. So it was a very interesting sight at the airport itself. One saw that sort of Israelis getting back and they're being cheered on and welcomed by fellow compatriots, fellow countrymen at the airport itself.
Right. And after your entry into Israel, could you tell us the impression you got when you met the civilians who were bearing the major brunt of this war?
So people of Israel are really sort of upset, angry at these horrific attacks and the level of brutality that has been documented so far by Hamas attackers themselves. And it against women, children, elderly, and the hostages, which are more than 200 hostages. The last count, I think there were about 220, 222 odd hostages, as Israelis as well as foreign passport holders, Americans, French, Italian, so from different nationalities. So it has really has had a huge impact on Israelis because they have not seen this scale of a horrific attack and hostage situation for a while now. And in the last 50 years, this is after the Yom Kippur War, this is one of the most horrific, brutal attacks that they have seen. So they are quite upset, angry at these attacks. Obviously, there is a sense of sort of retribution and revenge for these attacks. That's the mood on the street, Israel, in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, Ashdod, Sderot, Ashkelon, wherever I traveled. And people also are upset with the military and the intelligence and the political leadership they feel the forewarning has not took place. There was failure of intelligence, a failure of response by the Israeli military on 7th of October. So that's the Israeli sort of response and the impact on Israel.
Right. And now coming to the war, when you spoke to the Israeli military's international spokesperson, Lieutenant Colonel Peter Lerner, what did he have to say about the escalation and the fact that Israel is facing criticism for the intensity of their airstrike on Gaza?
Well, he interestingly pointed out, that the optics of the war are obviously tragic. And he was essentially mentioning about the challenge of striking at Hamas while there are civilians in Gaza. So essentially, Israeli Air Force or Israeli military is mindful of the fact, they know about the fact that this challenge is there where they target military installations, but they also know there will be casualties. So essentially, they have to factor in the military necessity as well as the proportionality of response. So they are in a tight spot. However, they have been conducting airstrikes, and a lot of people in Gaza have been killed. So the toll of civilians has been going up, but there is sort of that kind of a challenge exists for the Israeli military.
And could you also tell us what kind of toll the siege in Gaza has taken on the residents there?
Well, I spoke to the UN agency spokesperson, UNRWA, which is essentially the only UN agency right now which is present in Gaza. The spokesperson, Adnan, who I spoke to, he's in his 50s and he lived in Gaza City with his family and is now moved to Rafah, which is closer to the Egyptian border crossing. And he sort of told me that how the city has been sort of bombed, and now there is sort of lack of fuel. So because there is lack of petrol, which used to come through the Rafah border crossing, through the Egyptian border crossing, and so because of lack of fuel, there is lack of power, lack of electricity, and that is leading to things like hospitals which are sort of without power, without electricity. So there are no instruments, surgeries can't be performed, the medicines are in short supply. In fact, he even told me that there are even lack of body bags because they don't have enough body bags to cover the dead bodies. Also, he told me that there's drinkable water is in short supply. He himself went through the market and couldn't find a bottle of drinkable water, and there are desalination plants which function, but one has to buy that water, and people are just drinking from the water well, untreated water. So that's prone to diseases. And UNRWA, the only UN agency which is now there, it runs shelters. And he said that about 600,000, which is 6 lakh people are in these shelters run by UNRWA. An equal number is probably outside these shelters, and they're on the streets, they're sort of out in the open, and they have terrified civilians who don't know what will happen in next 5 minutes.
Now, Shubhajit, this is not only concentrated on Gaza and Israel, right? The effect of the war also spilled over to the occupied West Bank. So can you tell us, what have you seen when you visited West Bank?
Yeah, I went to Ramallah, I went to the West Bank, and Ramallah is the capital city. So there I went around the main, downtown Ramallah where shops were open. But, people were protesting against the airstrikes in Gaza. There were protesters who had families in Gaza, and there were workers from Gaza who had been deported to West Bank. In fact, there are workers from Gaza who work in Israel as construction workers or as farm laborers, as agricultural laborers. And those workers had been deported to or sent back to West Bank. So they were away from the families, they were worried, and they were all asking for end of the siege and end of the airstrikes in Gaza. So that was the mood, that was the sense one got. I also spoke to one of the top Palestinian leaders who was the information minister, Mustafa Barghouti, and he also talked about the plight of people of Gaza who he said that were under Israeli occupation, and he also called on the Indian government to intercede and influence and try and tell the Israeli government to not go side with the Israeli government. So that was the tone and tenor of the voices from the West Bank.
And speaking about India, it is said that it firmly stands with Israel, and then India also sent humanitarian relief to Gaza. So how would you describe India's response to this war?
Yeah, so India has obviously done a diplomatic balancing act after initially it had expressed support for Israel and had condemned the terror attacks, saying that Israel, they stand in solidarity with Israel and they condemned terrorism in all its manifestation. But then it also said that they advocate direct negotiations between Israel and Palestine and call for two-state solutions. And then, after the conversation with Mahmoud Abbas, India has now sent humanitarian aid to for the people of Gaza via Egypt, of course. And so that has been the diplomatic balancing act done by India.
And could you tell us what kind of impact this war is having on the West Asia region?
So, on wider West Asia, the countries have taken different positions. So, the Arab world is obviously divided. As you know, UAE, Bahrain had criticized Hamas. Saudis have taken a bit nuanced position so far. But, while these barbaric attacks on Israeli civilians have been condemned, there is also concern of the civilian casualties, which are collateral damage in Gaza. So the West Asia is right now is in a very tough situation. It's in a very turmoil right now, and one has to see how the positions evolve in the next few days, weeks. If Israel chooses to go for ground invasion as well as does more of aerial strikes with more of civilian casualties. So then we'll have to see how the countries, especially the Western countries, including the US, how they balance the issue of obviously revenge and retribution against Hamas, but also of the civilian casualties which may happen due to the collateral damage.
So, after being in the war zone, Shubhajit, what would you say was that one thing that stood out to you amidst this, complex situation that the region finds itself in?
I think the people on both sides are the biggest sufferers. When I went to the southern Israeli parts, towns like Sderot, Ashkelon, these towns near the Israel-Gaza border were deserted. People had to be evacuated. They left their homes and are now being housed in hotels and shelters and hostels in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and some other cities. So people have been internally displaced with their kids, with their older people. For example, I saw a lot of young women with children and old parents or parents-in-laws who are now displaced. The numbers are anywhere between 1.2 lakh to 3 lakh people who have been internally displaced within Israel. But there's been also a sense of community that one can see where people are volunteering to give them support in social services as social workers, just giving them psychological help or just giving them medicines. Hospitals are reaching out to take care of the elderly. So those are the things we could see. People are suffering, but also communities are coming forward. On the Gaza side, which I have not been there, but I've spoken to people there, and there also the devastation on people is very, very huge, and they are impacted very heavily. So people, so as I told you earlier, that there is lack of medicines, lack of water, lack of the food, bread lines are increasing. So people have to be evacuated again from Gaza city towards the Rafah, which is near the Egyptian border. So, in both the sides, it's the pain and the anxiety is being felt by the people while Israeli military and Hamas are at war. So, to me, on both sides, the people of Israel as well as the people in Gaza, the common, ordinary people, civilians, women, children, elderly, are the biggest sufferers of this escalation.
And next, we talk about Bihar. Last week, the Bihar government schools removed the names of more than 20 lakh students from their respective schools. Now, each year, around 2.5 crore students enroll in Bihar's government schools. And when we spoke to the Indian Express's Santosh Singh, he told us that this was part of an initiative by the Bihar government to ensure that deserving students receive the benefits of the public school system.
So, what the Bihar government looks at is quality of education and smooth functioning of midday meal And they have started a drive with the objective of the extending the government benefits to the deserving students. So they do not want any ghost entries in school rolls. That's why they started the drive in August, and it just concluded last week. It concluded, and by the final count, we have given the figure. It is over 20 lakh. And the main takeaway of this exercise is that 1.5 lakh children would not be able to write their class 10 and class 12 board examination next year. I think about 16 lakh children appear for class 10 boards, state board examination every year, and another 13 lakh children appear for class 12 board. That number is huge. Even if 1.5 lakh missing from that number, that's a big number. And don't know, government doesn't have any alternate mechanism where these children would go.
And Santosh explains that when the government started this drive back in August, they initially decided to strike off the names of students who had been absent from school for more than 30 consecutive days. Then they further reduced the threshold to 15 days. And by the end of the drive, schools began to deregister students who had been absent for even 3 consecutive days. Here Santosh mentions the reason for undertaking this drive.
There are broadly 2 issues. When we just analyze the entire case or entire situation, we find 2 outstanding things. There are 2 categories. One category of students are the ones who are also enrolled in private schools at the same time, with the hope that they might get sundry government benefits like scholar fees, uniform, and other benefits. And if they do not do well in, say, in private schools, they can go back to government schools and write their examination and pass from there. And the second category of students are the ones who help their parents in, say, in field, in purpose of agriculture, or in small shops where their parents, mother or father, work. And Additional Chief Secretary K.K. Pathak had been very harsh on them. In a sense, he just red flagged that so many students have been moving to private schools when there are so many private coaching centers mushrooming in Patna and all across Bihar. He found it very disconcerting trend. He said there has to be a stop somewhere.
And this is why the government's initiative raises questions. However, Santosh says that this government action appears to contradict their vision for what education should be in the state.
On one hand, the government is running a drive to bring back out of school children to school. On the other hand, they are striking off the names of these children. So what happens to these children? That could be the next question. The simple answer is that they have 2 options. Either they get medical certificate to get admission in the same school, or they have to wait for a year, or else they might try for another government school or even in private schools to get admitted in the same same academic year.
And as we mentioned earlier, due to this drive, 1.5 lakh students are at risk of missing their 10th and 12th board exams. Santosh says this is the reason that some teachers' organizations in the state have criticized the government for taking this action.
They are taking up the issue with the government, and they are citing provisions of Right to Education Act, which talks about universalization of a universal education to everyone. And there has to be a valid reason. Of course, government is citing the reason if a child is enrolled in 2 schools, his or her name has to be struck off. That is one sound reason. But there could be another reasons. Right now, so far, we have not heard anything from the government whether they are going to reconsider or not. Parents are looking for escape routes. They might try out so many private schools which are attached to, I think, CBSE or other boards, so that they can write their exams. And they might even try with another government school clandestinely, because it's the same government record, so that they can have their way. So far, there is no word on any relaxation from the government.
Santosh says the situation is a double-edged sword and could actually hurt the state's efforts to boost education.
On one hand, government is talking about discouraging private schools and coaching centers. On the other hand, they have been taking such harsh decisions. this will only prompt parents to send their wards to private schools. There are so many private schools. As I think about 8 years ago, we had done a series on ghost schools. There are so many schools in Bihar where students only appear for writing exams. You don't have to attend those schools. Your attendance is duly made there. You're enrolled there. Their attendance is there. They would show their attendance in the register, but in reality, they don't go to such schools. They don't have infrastructure. We had found in our investigation schools running, in a godown, in a one-room setup, things like that. So these trend could be only encouraged with such practice. Okay, government is talking about, okay, we want all the government benefits to reach out to the deserving ones. That is one way to look at it. You are also talking about bringing back out of school children or even dropouts back to schools. So both cannot work simultaneously. So government has to rethink. They should rather reach out to parents and guardians, run some conduct some meetings where they can motivate the parents and children to come back to their schools rather than take some stringent measures. In long run, it is not going to work.
And finally, we give you an update about ED raids in Rajasthan. Yesterday, the Enforcement Directorate carried out raids at locations linked to Rajasthan Congress President Govind Singh Dotasra and independent MLA Om Prakash Hudla. In a social media post on X, Rajasthan Chief Minister Ashok Gehlot stated that the probe agency has also issued summons to his son Vaibhav. Gehlot pointed out that the ED's action against Dotasra and summons to his son came just a day after his government had announced guarantees for women while campaigning for the upcoming state assembly elections. According to the image shared by Gehlot on social media, the ED had summoned Vaibhav to appear before it in connection with a Foreign Exchange Management Act or FEMA case. In a press conference later that day, Gehlot slammed the BJP government, accusing it of carrying out raids in the run-up to elections.
ये हालात है तो आप सोच सकते हो कि डेमोक्रेसी में अगर ऐसी सरकार बनी बैठी है दिल्ली में जो लोगों दिल जीतने के बजाय अपने कार्यों से, अपने व्यवहार से, अपनी नीतियों से, अपने कार्यक्रमों से, अपने सिद्धांतों से आप कामयाब हो, उसकी बजाय आप जो है आप गुंडागर्दी कर रहे हो. गुंडागर्दी है ये.
Gehlot accused the BJP of spreading terror in the country. He went on to say that the Congress would not be scared no matter how hard the BJP tried. While there is no official statement from the ED, the raids on Dotasra and Hudla are said to be in connection with the Paper Leaks and Public Health Engineering Department or PHED scam, respectively. This is the first time that raids have been conducted on Dotasra and Hudla. The paper leak case was registered after the leak of a question paper for the general knowledge of Senior Teacher Grade 2 competitive examination, which was scheduled to be conducted by the Rajasthan Public Service Commission in December 2022. The accused allegedly provided the question paper to appearing candidates for rupees 8 to 10 lakh per candidate. And the PHED case pertains to irregularities in the Jal Jeevan mission. You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. It was written and produced by me, Rahel Philipose, Utsa, Sarmin and Shashank Bhargava. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone who you think will like it. Share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.